everyone, Death's Advocate here. I'm doing something a little different than what I usually do, and we're going to do a tier list video today for the kind of the meta scene and what's going on with the meta decks right now. So, forgive my low production quality, but I had originally planned to just write this up, but it seemed like it would be an awful lot to write down and hard to write down without having some of the visual indicators. So, and everyone expressed some interest in it, so here we are. So I suppose let's just get right down to it here. I don't expect to be on too long, but we'll stay on as long as it takes. So before we talk about the decks themselves, let's just talk about Con Artist here. So Con Artist, we don't really have much in the way of like really oppressive S-tier decks or anything, but I felt like Con Artist was worth mentioning because he alone is kind of warping the metagame by himself. Just being kind of the auto 3-drop that every deck is going to play, and he's very specifically messing with the order of this tier list, because there's a lot of decks on here, like this school deck here, all of these Leviathan variants over here, or these item decks here that could very well be B or A tier decks, but Con Artist just being played in every single list is kind of keeping them much lower down on this list than they have potential to be. And, on that note, another thing about this tier list, this isn't saying things at A are insanely good and things in D are bad. The things in A are probably the best decks, and things in D tend to be either on the weaker side, or they're just not super favored against the best, most popular lists right now. And in fact, I don't think of this list as, worst to best necessarily. I think of this as just kind of a snapshot of the meta as the whole. There are a ton of other decks that we could include, 3, 4 more tiers of letters here that we could put things in. But this is just kind of my meta snapshot in general. Our decks even down here at the bottom are still pretty good. They have a little bit of trouble due to things like Con Artist or some of the top decks here. But let's get into the decks themselves a little bit after we because I think that's just enough talking about Con Artist. So there is one deck that I kind of have up here in S tier, and that's Corpse Burn. I'm not going to really share too many details on it because I don't want to see it spread. It's not like a terribly oppressive list. It's not unbeatable. There are a couple of the top lists that it has almost no chance against, like Last Will, or its Control counterpart, or even just some of the like Tomb Control variants. Like, it's definitely beatable. Like, any deck that's running just a good bunch of heals really messes it up. But the reason it's risen so high, and the reason I've put it here on this list now, is just because it completely crushes about 90% of the other things on this list here. And I think this is kind of due to Shaman, our neutral card, being nerfed. Back when we had, Shaman as like a 3-4 staple 3-drop that most decks ran, or a 2-drop that could be tutored by Gorilla and healed for 3, that kept any of these like pure burn decks from really being too much of a problem. Like, you could play them, but Shaman's existence kept them in check. But Shaman turning into kind of a weak 1-drop has allowed this deck to rise and bully a whole bunch of things on this list. So it's, far from like the best deck in the game, but it's a little tough on things now that Shaman's been nerfed. But that's enough talking about that, because I really don't want to spend too much time on it in general. So, at the top of our meta right now, we have a lot of tempo mid-range decks, which I like. I like that we have a very tempo mid-range meta. That tends to be one of the more fun metas, in my opinion, because on the extreme end, when you have control metas, people aren't really enjoying just not getting to play the game very much because everything they do gets deleted. Or on the other extreme, when you've got like aggro and burn, you also just don't get to play the game because the game just, ends in 2-3 turns and there's no interaction really going on. So I really like more tempo mid-range being kind of the meta, with aggro and burn as well as control helping keep everything else in check. Like aggro needs to be good so that the control decks don't get out of hand, and control needs to be good so that tempo decks can't just get too greedy and similar. But I'm still talking broad strokes. Let's try to talk about like some more of the decks themselves. So we've got tempo, resurrection, or a little bit more of a greedy resurrection. Both the Viking and the Warlock variants are both really strong. Just the amount of value these decks can put out by resurrecting powerful units on the cheap has just made them really good, especially when they get paired with either Red's Burn and AoE, or, well, Vikings for a similar reason, with like Ragnar and Yarm Lightning, but you're running the Vikings for more of their strong tempo units, whereas you're running Red for more of their more control stuff. Similarly, we've got kind of Tempo Dojo, which also does kind of the same thing here, just in a different way. The Resurrection list, that's really focusing on the card Resurrection itself, Valkyrie and Joanvive. This one's just Joanvive, this one's just Valkyrie. And Tempo Dojo's got a lot of other cool tricks. I showcased that recently. Just Dojo being such a powerful card right now has led Rise to kind of like an entire little archetype being built around it, playing some of the Berserk units and the Rush units. I'll show off actually some examples of these decks in a little bit, but I want to at least finish talking about all of our A tiers first. Then we've got Last Will, which did take a pretty sizable nerf with the documents going to 4 gold. It's slowed the deck down by a whole turn and forced it to include a little bit more ramp than it may have wanted it to, but I still think it's a top deck for sure, just because it's got really good matchups across the board. It's good against healing. It's got healing for aggro. It's got powerful top-end combo. It does certainly have counters. Somebody packing Dispel, or Transforms, or just a more aggressive game plan can definitely give it a run for its money, because these revive lists, they can absolutely put out a similar amount of value without being quite as reliant on said combo. Of course, Last Will does have Beast Mode itself, which can't mess up the revive deck, so we've got a pretty nice little dichotomy going on with these guys kind of just interacting with each other really nicely. Whereas then, we've got the Tempo Dojo, and then the Toolbox deck, which this is also a dojo list, but this one's really cool because it's using more of the bounce synergy to just use a lot of cool cards. Rather than only getting to run 2 Sea Witch, you're running 7. Rather than getting to run 2 Shaman, you're running 7. And rather than getting to run just basically whatever card you need most in the particular matchup, this deck gets to just play that card repeatedly. So it's really cool, and it's got just some really strong stuff going on with it in addition to the dojo trick. I think there's going to be some version of Pirate Viking deck that's going to be at the top of the meta no matter what. Just the nature of these two faction colors put together is just always good. It changes very frequently. The balance patches and the meta shifts drastically change what this deck looks like on a regular basis, and even now there's a few different variations of it. You can be a little bit more ramp focused, you can be a little bit more just kind of on curve, or you can do like some funky lightning combos. Right now, I think just the kind of on-curve tempo-y version's the best approach, but there are always, 3-4 versions of this deck, and they're always going to be kind of up here on the tier list. Just the combination of all that AoE and strong combos that Pirates and Vikings bring, and when you put them together, they're just really good against whatever's going on. Now, the one weak point, though, is they do tend to be a little bit weaker to the aggro and burn metas, because there's no good healing in this faction at all. So that's the only time they really get bumped down is if aggro or burn get out of control. But anytime there's anything that can keep aggro and burn in check, this deck's going to be up here at the top. And then, of course, you've got Fire, Bounce. Fire Ninjas are just a really powerful deck in general. I'm probably not going to talk too much about it for the same reason I'm not talking too much about the Corpse Burn list, just because I just don't want to see a ton of it. I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a pretty cool deck. You know, it does a happy medium between playing with the board and burning your opponent. It's just really strong in general. Getting to bounce some of the powerful cards like Headmaster Saurus or Magmasaur and use those effects repeatedly with good control suite and AoE. It's just a really powerful deck all around. And it's definitely earned its spot. You know, it took semifinals in the last tournament, and I think it's a deck that can compete very well with anything else we have going on here. And so these are the decks that are kind of at the top, and they're all pretty healthy decks with good counterplay, reasonably high skill ceilings, and none of them are particularly toxic, and I think that's a pretty healthy metagame. So then right below them, we have some things that are probably just as powerful as the things in the top end, but they have some bad matchups, so they're a little tiny bit more riskier to play. Like, for example, like Tomb Control. It's one of my favorite decks of all time, and it can beat a good bunch of these top decks, but it can struggle against the Fire Bounce, just Blaze, or even just Swordsman can give it a bit of a hard time. Similarly, it can really struggle versus the other things down here and be this the heavy control version of Screams just kind of does what this deck does a little bit better in the control angle. So this one's better suited to beating these top lists, but it struggles against this, heavy control list. This one's putting out a lot of bodies that the tempo list has to contend with, but it's just not as powerful as the double Screams in the end game. So it's as strong as the A-list decks, but it struggles a bit against, its Scream mirrors or the Fire Bounce. And of course, Tomb mirrors in general are just always awkward. It's hard for me to ever want to place a Tomb deck at the top because anytime you run into a Tomb mirror of any kind, they're very snowbally matches. It often very much depends on who just gets the first batch of Tombs to use first. So they're kind of risky to play in really high-end tournaments. With that being said, they're fun decks, and if you're not too greedy with your Tombs, there are definitely things you can do to have a more skilled matchup there. But it's just the nature of Tombs itself makes the mirrors always a little bit awkward. And if you're ever in metas with really good board wipes that specifically affect Tombs like Blaze does, they can struggle a little bit more. They're really good against Pirates, though, because Pirates has a harder time wiping those Tombs despite being able to blow zombies up. But you don't always have to rely on the zombies. A good Tomb deck usually tries to strike a little bit of a balance between its zombie spam and other things like Bone Drake or Corpse Explosion, things like that. So similarly, Tomb combo here, when you bring it with Vikings, it's kind of a happy medium between, the control decks and the more tempo list. It gets to do, big wacky Freya Z-Think combos, and, it's solid. But it's not as powerful in the end game, and it's not as powerful as the tempo lists up here, so really cool, really powerful deck, but it just, certain matchups can be a little tricky on it. So Frost, I don't have a very specific deck for Frost, because you can run it either as a small package and mix it with most of the lists here, or you can run it more of a dedicated list and make it more, dedicated Frost, where it's 24 cards are Viking, and you're running just a handful of tech from another faction. But either way, it's a really strong deck. It's got a ton of different variants. Frost alone could be an entire tier list by itself. And the reason why it's in B here is for kind of two reasons. One, well, mostly it's mostly just ninjas. Ninjas are really hard on Frost, and ninjas are really popular right now because Kai Jr. being in the meta means it's really hard to keep your Temple of Frost sticking around, and then trying to rely on freezing stuff is super vulnerable to the replace mechanic. So just ninjas in general are kind of keeping Frost out of A tier just for how awkward of a matchup that is for them. So while we do have the Resurrection variant of Yellow-Red up here in A-list, I think there's also like a dozen different Red-Yellow decks that are just really powerful. None of them are quite as good as that Resurrection list, but they're all really close to it. You've got the more ramp-focused ones, you've got the more aggro-focused ones, you've got the more control-focused ones. There's so many different ways you can build it. Or you've got like the tribal with knights and dinos. There's so many different ways you can build this, Red Yellow Crusaders, and they're really cool because they don't really have a bad matchup. They're just kind of good against everything, but they lack that raw power of these A-list decks. So they're a really stable list that's really solid and fun to play, but they can compete with anything on here, even up in the A, but they're always feeling just a little bit more of a struggle. You got to work a little harder for those wins. The Dino decks, again, you can do the more, red-yellow Dino versions, or you can do my favorite version with the ninjas. They were S tier briefly, and I don't think they're quite cutting it for A, but they're really close. It's kind of hard to stand up to just like the Resurrection or the Last Will in-game combos, but if they get a good hand, like Dinos can beat anything here. Like a good on-curve evolution is just so brutal to deal with. So they're kind of a little bit more of a high roll list. They're really fun, really powerful. They've got a pretty high skill ceiling too, but they're not quite reliable enough to be A, despite being able to blow A out of the water with a good hand. So just by virtue of being a little bit more high rolly, they're just a little bit lower on that list. Then we've got this, anti-meta white-blue lightning. There's quite a few different versions of this as well, but this is just a really neat deck that's kind of solid all around. And there's quite a few ways you can build it, but it's always fun because it's not only just kind of good on its own, but it can be built very specifically to beat the meta. For example, so if you're in Druids, you've got Beast Mode and Season of Growth, and those two things just utterly mess up the Resurrection pools, so it really gives those decks kind of a hard time. Of course, you've got the Ragnar Yarm Lightning combos, so any of those greedier building style lists are open to getting punished by that. Any deck that, and it's got Druids, so it's got good healing and good draw, so it's good against aggro, and then against decks that are a little, more greedy and aren't running a lot of control, owlbears can just overwhelm it. It's got a lot going for it, but again, it kind of similar to the red-yellow list, it just lacks the raw power of those top decks. It can be really good to counter those top decks, but it can just get kind of surprised and beaten by anything else on the list. The Double Screams control deck's been rising to popularity. I think Scare Owl's the one that really kind of gave it some, not infamy, there's a better word. Anyways, made it more popular just because he kind of religiously streamed it on the regular. And it's a pretty solid list. There's a couple different ways you can go with it. You can do the more artillery version, or you can do, double down on the control, or you can do it a little bit more swarmy. There's a few different ways you can build in. It's really strong, but what it mostly comes down to is Headmaster being able to cast Screams of the Fallen twice is a really brutal combo that unless people are prepared for, like they're running Maldron, like this anti-meta deck has here, or Elephants, can be really hard to deal with. So it's a pretty solid list in general. It's kind of the epitome of control, and it is pushing the boundaries for what is a healthy level of control. But this version of it I think is better because it's got plenty of counterplay. Because again, elephant's a neutral card. If this gets too popular, people can just start running elephants and they'll fare pretty well against it. Unlike the Corpse Burn version, which doesn't even bother with Screams of the Fallen, and it's just kind of either you're a faction with a lot of healing or you're not. Then we've got Mordanoth. He's a really cool new card. Gave a really good boost to the skeleton package. It's a really solid. I've tried the more ninja version of it and tried making that work, and it's pretty good too. But it lacks some of the tools that pirates are bringing. This one can do the fancy Mordanoth bounce, but if you survive to the turn and have a good hand size, and can afford to play Mordanoth a couple of times, like you deserve to win, and that's kind of harder to do. But it's certainly a viable and fun approach, but I think the pirate version just handles its matchups in general a lot better because it gets to do some cool tricks like using Parrot with Witch Doctor. It gets to main deck. Man the cannons and Daggerstorm. Although I think I might have skipped Daggerstorm in my current version, but it's got a lot of cool things going on with it. Similar to Tombs, though, it's still a Tomb deck when it comes down to it. So it has some of the same issues that regular Tomb decks have. Of course, it plays a little bit differently because of how Mordanoth can come down and instantly swing a game. But the trouble you can run into, though, is if you're having a tough matchup, it's going to make you play a lot of the cards in your hand, and then Mordanoth gets steadily weaker as the game goes on. So things have to go kind of right for the deck, or you need to draw Mordanoth on curve. And if you do that, it's pretty devastating. But if you run into a bad matchup and you don't draw Mordanoth at the perfect time, you can struggle here. So it kind of has that high roll issue that dinos have sometimes. Things need to go well for it, and when things go well for it, it's devastating. But it's just not quite reliable enough to really be up there in A tier. Whereas Tomb Control and Tomb Combo are reliable enough to do that, they just have some bad matchups. So over here on the right here, we've got, Red Blue, Warlock Viking. There's a million different variations of this, where there's very aggressive decks using mini Last Will engines or going more pure burn. Or of course the notorious Aggro Swarm, which this kind of is home to. Traditionally, Aggro Swarm was more of the ninja Vikings with the rats, and this deck was just an absolute terror in the meta for a while. It was such a nightmare that we had to, super buff AoE, because otherwise just nothing could compete with it at all. But now, because every single one of the top decks in the meta is running some combination of pirates, warlocks, and Vikings, it's been kind of shunted down to C, despite still being one of the most powerful and polarizing lists in the game. The top decks are very specifically tech to deal with it. So it's kind of been pushed down to here. Even though this deck is probably S tier levels of power, the meta is just really well prepared for it. And I think that's pretty important because it's just a very polarized list in general, so I don't ever want to see this deck really taking over the top end of the game again. I was glad that, Vaunt said today that he has no intention of nerfing AoE, so that I'm glad about that. I think Swarm is cool. I love Swarm. I play lots of Swarm decks, but this hyper polarized Aggro Swarm version, it really needs to have good counters to. And because it does, it's sitting down here in C tier. despite having S tier levels of power, the meta is prepared to deal with it. And the meta has to be prepared to deal with it, because anytime you bring a greedier deck, you risk just getting absolutely steamrolled by this. Which is a big reason why you haven't been seeing color combinations like purple-yellow as much anymore, just because their lack of really good AoE means they're hyper vulnerable to these Stormy decks. But let's talk about, again, the red-blue version, which is the not quite as much raw power, probably, but it's way less vulnerable to just dying to AoE, because they can run lots of little tricks like the baby dinosaur and other little last will tricks, or more burn, or a healthy mix of both. So this is kind of the more reliable, less polarized, but just powerful aggro list in general that can actually stand up to the AoE meta. It's a deck that really punishes any kind of greedy deck. This alone kind of keeps things like the double scream lists and any of the really greedy ramp versions of these A-list decks. The ramp versions are more in C tier these days, just because of how powerful this aggro approach is. So this really, and I don't like aggro, but I acknowledge that it's important to keep the game healthy, and I think this is exactly where aggro decks should be. They should be close to A tier, but they shouldn't actually be there, because nobody wants to play an aggro meta that all the games are just ending on turn 4, because that you're barely getting to play the game at that point. But it needs to exist to keep lists from being too greedy and just neglecting running early curve. This keeps the deck healthy. I do not know if there's an aggro deck in A tier, we have a problem, because now the entire tier list warps and shifts, and everything gets shunted down to D tier, except for like the 4 decks that can hard counter it. The moment you put aggro or swarm in A tier, you have a horrible warping of the effect, and 90% of these decks stop being viable. And that's why this is where it should be. It should be very powerful. It should absolutely be able to beat anything up here in the top tier with either a good pilot, a bit of luck, or a good hand. But it should not be A tier itself, because otherwise you just invalidate 90% of decks, and the only decks that get to play are the ones that are hyper teched against it, which you don't want. This is exactly where it should be. Powerful, keeps the game healthy, good for new and seasoned. So Swarm deck and aggro have a lot of overlap. They're very often overlap. Now, I do have a good handful of them over here. The rat versions, they're not usually aggro. They're actually like really cool combo decks, and they're lots of fun. I like them, and they're pretty strong too. They have a little bit of trouble, again, against these top A tier lists. I think they absolutely have the power of A tier for sure, but by virtue of having to keep aggro swarm and aggro burn in check, they're struggling a little bit more in the meta. I'll talk about them in a minute here. But yeah, as I was saying, this is exactly where aggro should be. A powerful B tier list that keeps the game healthy and keeps decks from being too greedy. If it's any stronger than this, we start getting bad meta warping. If it's any weaker than this, then that's not fair to the aggro players, and it lets greedy decks be too greedy. So let's talk a little bit more about the rats here. So rats have a lot of really cool things going on. One version in particular, the version with like Friends of Dragons and Freya, I think that one's actually, a proper competitive list that does really well for itself. Again, it has such a bad matchup against the top 6 lists here that it's, despite probably being A tier power, it's kind of shunted down to C, just because it's got some bad matchups against some of the more popular things right now. Whereas the Lionel and the Crab version of that, both also really good decks, but they struggle even more so. Well, they don't struggle more so. They're actually probably a little better equipped for like the heavy AoE things, but they also just lack that raw power of the ability for the rat deck of you didn't draw AoE that turn, well, time for Friends of Dragons and it's game over. And like the Freya combos make this deck so deadly and let it even compete pretty well with these top decks, because even if they get their board wiped, if they've saved up enough gold, they can do some giant out of hand combos, whereas these ones, if they lose their tempo, they have a little bit more trouble coming back. They still can, because thanks to things like King Kaiju, Crab, and a couple other tricks, we'll actually look at some deck lists in a little bit here. They can do well, but they have a harder time coming back or just ending a game on the spot. But I like these decks. I think they're fun. I'm looking forward to getting a little bit more support for them. But I hope that support comes more in the form of more cool things like King Kaiju or other, medium cost cards. If we're getting Swarm support that's, up there in the 5-7 cost range, like Friends of Dragons and that kind of range, that's cool. That'll allow for these decks to rise probably back up to B, maybe even A, without us running into that, aggro burn or hyper swarm polarization. It can let these decks be cool, fun combo decks that aren't super reliant on having a million rats on the board, even though that's still something they absolutely do. So I'm looking forward to some of that new Swarm support that was coming, that Vaughn mentioned, said was a strong possibility. I just hope, again, it comes in the form of the mid-range style. Because if we're supporting mid-range Swarm, that's awesome. I want to see mid-range Swarm. That should be a lot of fun. And again, even right now, I think these are perfectly viable decks that you can absolutely play, even in top-tier competition. You are going to have a tough matchup against some of the most popular decks. Not unwinnable by any stretch, especially since you're not super reliant on just the rats. You've got some other cool tricks too. We've also got a couple other tomb decks down here. So both Mordanoth and the purple bounce version, it's got some really cool tricks, being able to play Mordanoth repeatedly. Or this one's got some cool stuff because it gets to run stuff like Owlbear and Maldron. But the problem is these color combinations don't have AoE, which means they are really, really vulnerable to swarmy decks or even tempo decks or even just aggro. Like, you can build them to be prepared for aggro, but the problem is if somebody gets a good hand and you miss one turn of curve and your opponent plays a 1-2 3 and then 2/2 drops, and they've just got this giant board and you don't have the AoE to answer it, you just lose on the spot. And it's really unfortunate because these are otherwise really cool, really powerful decks that actually have really good matchups against some of the top decks, but just the mere existence of Swarm, tempo, and aggro keeps them from really rising up to where well, the Crusader version also doesn't have a lot of AoE. It's got a lot more control, and it can just heal, and then end of days and survive long enough to do that. They just don't really have any form of AoE at all available to them, which keeps them down here despite having the raw power to compete with even the stuff at the top. You've also got some very cool, like the self-harm decks where you're playing things like Maldron and Lava Giant that get to do some very cool combos. And it's a really solid deck. It doesn't quite have that same in-game punchiness that stuff like Double Screams or Joan Vive into Valkyries or the massive value of dojo decks. It just doesn't quite have that raw power of these A and B tier lists. That being said, very similar to yellow-red control. It's a lot of fun. It can compete with anything. It doesn't really have any bad matchups. It's got answers for everything. It's got all kinds of really cool combos. So it's a deck that you could absolutely pilot well all the way up into top level competition. But it's going to be a little bit of a harder go against some of the top decks here. And that being said, I haven't tested it a whole lot. Maybe it could be optimized enough so it could creep up in this tier list. I've only done, 20 or so games with it, and it's a lot of fun. But I think this is where it belongs right now. And then let's just talk about Leviathan in general. So, Leviathan decks, really cool, really fun. You've got like the Hyperdraw. Oh, right. I suppose we still need to talk about this guy over here, Vileroth School Contraband Leviathan. I'll circle back to him in just a moment. I almost overlooked that. But so yeah, Leviathan, very cool. You can play it like Hyper Draw, you can play it more Hyper Control, you can do it just kind of tempo-y curve up until you're winning in the late game by being able to play the cheap Leviathans, or you can really go all in and do the whole Sea Witch, or not Sea Witch. Sea Witch is kind of a staple card in most pirate decks. The Sea Hag and Manfish combo, where you can basically cycle the last couple cards of your deck infinitely and just have a million Leviathans and a deck that's bigger than everyone else's, which is really cool. But Con Artist, I'm a little afraid of Leviathan. I'm kind of glad Con Artist keeps it in check, but Con Artist being in every deck ever just means dedicated Leviathan lists are having kind of a bad time for the most part. With one exception, of course, and that's this Vileroth School deck. This one's really good for a whole bunch of reasons. Like, first of all, it's got the Pirate Warlock combo, so that means it's got oodles and oodles of AoE. So any kind of tempo, mid-range, swarm, aggro list is going to have a bad time versus it. And then it's also got, against greedier decks like even the Revive list, late game Leviathans can be kind of hard on those. And then of course it's got the horrifying mid-game combos with Vileroth. With a good Vileroth is if your opponent doesn't answer Vileroth immediately, especially if he's got like Berserk, he's pretty devastating. Now, unfortunately, in this color combination, you miss out on the big, cool Vileroth combo. Like, what you really want to do with Vileroth is still get blue and red as your contraband, because that gives you Cleave and Berserk. But that version of the deck, that's around here somewhere. Where is that? Did I forget to... Oh, here it is. It's right below it. That's the dwarf school nope, that's... Huh. Maybe I don't actually have that example. Oh, right. No, I think that's this. Oh, here it is. Sorry. The Dragon's Gold version. That's the one that I'm talking about. This is the one that usually really uses Vileroth as more of a win condition more than a big tempo play. But the big reason Leviathan's in this deck is, in addition to just being a strong tempo play, the whole reason this deck exists and why it's over here is this is like the primo school deck. This is the one that lets you just OTK people out of nowhere, and it's really powerful because it's got a lot of really cool tricks going on. But the problem with it, and why it's not an A, is a couple of reasons. So first of all, Con Artist keeps the Vileroth side, or not the Leviathan side of this deck in check. Then the other part of it is it's really reliant on library. If you cannot find your library, or you run into a bunch of Kai Juniors or even just pterodactyls, and if people can answer your library right away, or you just don't find it, then you're playing a much slower deck and you're going to have a harder time. So there's a lot of building answers. So that keeps that in check, which is good though, because School is a terrifyingly powerful combo deck that can just kill you out of absolutely nowhere. So it absolutely needs to be kept in check, especially when this deck has the powerful late game with Leviathan, as well as the powerful early and mid game thanks to the AoE. So it's very good that this deck is being kept in check, because it's a it's a bit of a monster, and we haven't even talked about Headwood yet, and just the nastiness of an on curve. Like if you play Library and follow him up with Headwood just on curve, that is some devastating aggro that can just end a game right away. Unless somebody immediately answers with an Omewa Shindaru or a Dispel, like Headwood will just end a game on turn 4. And this deck does a lot of crazy, crazy, wacky combos between Leviathan Spam, School, and Vile Wrath, and it's got this Grendel library Headwood engine that lets it just chew through its deck and find its combos really fast. So devastatingly powerful combo deck, but one that's kept in check really well by a lot of the tools available to us, which is really good, because if this deck was any higher rated here, I would probably be having a fit because of just the amount of crazy, wacky stuff it can do. If we didn't have good counters to this, it would absolutely be S, because it'd just be a whole lot of AoE, 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 oh, guess you're dead from full now. But similar to Agrolist, I'm actually, it's kind of a cool deck. I will probably even maybe show it off when I get around to the example portion of this stream. So it's cool. I'm a sucker for a cool combo deck, and this deck is all about big combos. So I like it, but it's very good that it's being kept in check. I was really worried School was going to take over the meta for a while, but thankfully we've got good building answers. Con Artist, although again, I do think Con Artist probably needs to get a very small nerf. Like, it still needs to be a viable card so it can keep decks like this in check, which is why I keep suggesting like 3/3 Con Artist is what we should probably do. And so, but I think that's enough talking about that one. Let's circle back down to some of our other lists. Okay, so dragons for a while were all in A tier. They were just, I think they were the way to go for meta. You had every combination of dragons possible were just A tier. Like, Dragon Temple was just that good, and the fact that they're, pretty solid lists even without Dragon Temple means like that they were the meta. But after Dragon Temple went to 3 gold and 3 health, that really hurt them. Like, they're still really good decks, but there's 2 reasons they moved from A to C rather than A to B. And so first of all, again, just the Temple nerf really hurt them in general, and B, they're kept in check by a lot of the same things that are keeping School in check. Just the fact that we've got really good building answers, as well as things like Con Artist making their deck draw a little bit less reliable. They're having a little bit more trouble now against what's going on in the meta. Like, why bother with Dragon Temple when you can just play a little more tempo or on curve? That being said, they're still very good, very fun, very strong list. They can absolutely compete with everything. They were hurt pretty hard by that nerf, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because they were kind of ruling the meta there for a while. But to be fair, dragons are also really cool, so, I don't know. I wasn't fully on board with the Dragon Temple nerf. Like, I acknowledged that Dragon Temple was a bit overtuned, but it was fun, playing with the dragons. But it's okay. I think they're in a good spot right now. They're still perfectly viable. They're still fun. They're still really easy decks to play that do pretty well against most things. But between the nerf and the lots of building hate in the meta, they've fallen a bit here. So we've got a couple different versions of beast decks here. So beast decks are pretty fun. They've been just all over the place in the last bunch of patches. They've been in every category here. They've been S, they've been A, B, C. They've been all over the place. Right now, they're doing okay for themselves. Like, the really cool versions of the deck that are more centered around Torgon, they're really fun, and they're my favorite. And they've got the most raw power. They've got maybe even arguably S tier power, but they run into the same problem that Ninja Necromancers or Necromancer Druids do. Of this means you are playing a faction color that lacks AoE, and that means Aggro and Swarm is just gonna give you a bad time. You just have this giant glowing red weak spot that keeps you from really being any higher than C, despite having some really, really powerful tricks and combos. So the C variant here is the more all-in, just like search Beast, search Replace, add all of those cards, and that's your deck. It's really solid, really cool. And then you get the whole Torgon trick here, and that keeps it here. Now there's a really cool version of the deck which only runs like 9 units with Torgon. It's just all about multiplying rabbits and shark, and that one's really cool, but it's a little slow to set up, and if you don't draw Torgon, it's just kind of game over. So despite that this deck being insane levels of powerful, if you don't draw Torgon, you just kind of lose. Now the Viking version, this one's going really hard on the aggressive beast style. It's running a lot of the 1-drops to pair with the owl, and it's got the Ragnar combo, like really strong, aggressive list. And the only reason it's down here in C right now is just because it does tend to struggle a little bit against the raw value that the Resurrection decks or the Control decks put out. Double Screams and the Resurrection lists is kind of keeping this deck down. It does really well against most things, and it can be built more like this anti-meta version, but the dedicated Beast version, it lacks some of the tools and tech to deal with the meta that the anti-meta version does. So still perfectly viable, still lots of fun, but it's just got not a great matchup against some of the top decks, despite being in a really good place right now. Similarly, Bounce Joan Vive is still S tier levels of powerful, but it has the problem of there's no good AoE in these colors, so Aggro and Swarm is just a giant glowing red weak spot, which just makes this way too risky to play in the meta, despite its raw power. The best version of the deck here is a little bit more mid-rangey and just kind of runs all of the bounce stuff, so it can just play Joan Vive a lot rather than really trying to maximize that Joan Vive. The more maximized Joan Vive ones, they're struggling even more now because they're even slower, and the top end lists right now are doing similarly powerful in-game stuff. So the really greedy ramp versions of this, they've kind of fallen into more of a meme tier area, despite still being wildly powerful. But the balance control one, this deck can still absolutely crush everything on here that isn't aggro or swarm, but it's just got such a glowing red weak spot that it's got to be down here in C. So Dwarf School, this is a really cool combo deck, another one I was really just kind of scared of in general, and I was really worried it was going to take over the meta, but again, it's kept in check for the same reason the Leviathan version is. The meta is really well equipped to deal with it. If you ever leave a library or a school alive for a single turn, it's usually game over versus these decks. But that also just doesn't happen very often, so it struggles a little bit. And while this one has more powerful school combos and is the version of the deck that can take multiple, like 5-6 turns in a row if you let it do its thing, it doesn't have those fallbacks that this version does with the Leviathans or the Vile Wrath. So it just lacks the fallbacks of this one, which is just really powerful all around. This one, if it gets to do its combo, nothing's beating it. But if it doesn't get to do its combo, it's going to struggle a lot. Whereas this version can still be just fine even without its crazy combo. Similarly, we've still got some kind of Last Will Joan Vive deck over here, but same problem that a lot of the C-list decks have here is, despite being really powerful on paper, they are just those aren't AoE colors, and Swarm and Aggro are so strong that running without AoE is just really risky right now. So that's the reason why most of the things in C tier here are either because they lack the AoE colors or because they kind of have a bad matchup against the top decks. Like, they're all really powerful, viable lists, but you know, they either just fold hard to aggro and swarm, or have a not great matchup against the top decks. But like, you can absolutely still play everything A, B, and C in top level games, no problem. You could absolutely win a tournament with anything in A, B, or C here with a little bit of luck, or if you were really smart about your matchups. You know, you don't just play bounce control, you know, all the way through the tournament. You look at your opponent, you study what your opponents are playing, and you know, you bring this out when you're pretty sure you're not going to be running into aggro swarm or something like that. And if you play the matchup game, like, C is where like you have to get really meta. If you really play the meta game and know the matchups, like, you could bring a handful of C lists and, you know, win a tournament with that just by bringing the right C list at the right time. Right, which, yeah, Jay is a perfectly good example of that. Like, Jay went and stomped one of our S tier metas. Like, he took Cosmic Sword Gang versus the S tier Ragnar meta and took it all the way to the top. And he did that exactly because it was the only deck that could beat Ragnar meta. So, but because it was the Ragnar meta, you know, Swarm, never heard of it. Then, like, none of the deck's bad matchups were anywhere around at all. So Jay is like, this is my style of deck, and this is the time to play, and he ran it all the way to finals, but I was playing something that was just too broken to exist, which thankfully shortly got nerfed, like, immediately after that tournament. So, yeah, C is, if you play your matchup game right, like, C is really cool. Oh boy, here's Red. I tried to time this well for it to be after Red stream, but Red was just going a little bit too late for me. I needed to get this done so I could get to bed. So we're almost done talking about our C tier decks, and I suppose the big part of what a lot of people are going to be here for is I'm just going to be doing a whole bunch of examples of everything we've got in here, and that's what everyone's probably here for anyways. So we'll get to that pretty soon here. Yeah, so I think that pretty much wraps up C tier here. All really powerful, solid, fun lists, fun decks that you can absolutely play competitively. You just have to be really careful about the matchup game. And then we come down to D tier. So these decks, these are ones that are either a little on the weak side, or, you know, they're just not very reliable. You know, Torrican Tutor is a great example of this. This deck is devastatingly powerful. It's hilarious. It's fun to play. But if you don't draw Torrican, you just lose. And on top of it, it's, you know, still vulnerable to the aggro swarm type stuff. And same kind of deal with the Wraths versions. You know, these ones they're really fun, tricky, powerful decks, but they are struggling a little bit in the meta here, and they lack that raw, just insanity power. Oh, Crab Rats is mislabeled. That should be green purple, not green blue. So ignore that. My one little hiccup there. I'll fix that before I release this image into the wild. So yeah, they're very fun, tricky, cool decks, but you know, they're struggling a little bit against the top end of the meta, and they don't have those just devastating combos that the Freya / Friends of Dragons version of the lists do. Like, they're actually probably better against a lot of other decks around, but they struggle a little bit more against, you know, the really AoE heavy stuff. But that being said, they're really fun, they're really solid decks. Like, King Kaiju is great, and if you really want to like compete and try to take it to the tournament, you should probably bring the Viking variant. But it's a little risky to play because it can have some tough matchups. But again, you don't have to rely nearly as heavily on your swarm as you do with the traditional more aggro swarm or type angle, because you've got the cool King Kaiju tricks and stuff like that as well. Then we have a couple variants of Leviathan. These two decks here would probably immediately jump up to B tier if Con Artist gets nerfed. Same deal with these item decks here. These might jump up to A tier. If Con Artist just got deleted from the game, these decks go from kind of a funky gimmick to incredibly powerful. But right now, just Con Artist keeps I've even got like a red circle around these guys just to highlight that as well. Like these decks have a terrifying amount of potential, but Con Artist being in almost every single deck means they're kind of stuck down here in meme tier. We've got some really funky church decks here. There's some really cool stuff going on. They can do some really wild combos, oftentimes with school as well, but Church is struggling for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's got the same matchup problems that the other versions of school does, but then it also lost Priest, which was its big enabler that was making it be more consistent early on, and it just needs a little bit more support. It's still a really fun, cool, wacky combo deck, but it's struggling with the general matchups, and it's just not nearly as reliable as the school decks that are above it. But it's pretty cool. Speaking of which, there is like a non-church version of this, just in rather than running, you can run like the Final Flash version of school, which is pretty strong. Like that's another version of the Crusader Warlocks that does pretty well for itself. But the church version, that's kind of just the all-in gimmick. Maybe you get your funny, wacky combo, maybe you don't. If you don't, you're probably gonna lose. Beastburn, I put it down here mostly just because I think the more masochist version is this deck was briefly much higher up on the meta, but the moment Maul stopped being able to hit Castle, this deck lost a big chunk of what it was doing for Castle Burn. Like this deck used to be kind of up here with Corpse Burn and just the amount of Castle Burn it had, but now that Maul no longer hits Castle, it just kind of sunk, and I haven't revisited it. It might be better than I'm giving it credit for, but it needs some major reworking. But I think, again, if you reworked it, you'd probably just end up closer into the Masochist list in general, which is another list that I think, it might actually be a B-tiered deck. I just haven't really played it enough to say for sure, and I'm currently in the position of, the top decks usually have either good healing and or just really powerful, crazy, punchy end games that can have a little bit of a tough time competing with. Okay, and then you've got the Dark Mirror version of the combo tombs, which is really fun. You can either run it with or without tombs, but again, this is probably a B or an A tier deck if Con Artist didn't exist. Any deck you're trying to run Blacksmith in is just completely wrecked by Con Artist being in the meta. So as long as Con Artist is in every deck ever, like Mirror Control, Item Ragnar, or Veil OTK, they're just going to be memes despite having terrifying amounts of potential. You've also got some really cool like Spectral Rider buff decks as well. And they're fun. They're really solid, but they're just not reliable enough, I don't think, to really compete high end. But they're solid. Again, like this list here isn't saying this is all the decks in the game. This isn't saying, D is bad. This is just kind of a meta snapshot. Like even stuff in D here is seeing lots of good play in the meta and doing decently well for itself. It has some things that it struggles with, so that's why it's a little bit lower rated. And then, Beast Traps, that's just kind of another version of the Torgan bounce list. Again, it's solid, but traps are pretty good in general, and so is Torgan Beasts and stuff, but it's having the problem of it's trying to do some fun, wacky combos, but in colors that lack AoE, so you don't have just that raw aggro value of the Viking Beast version, nor do you have just the devastating did you draw Torgan deck. You've got a really cool, fun list, but doesn't have swarm counters, doesn't have great aggro counters, doesn't have a punchy end game, doesn't have the did I draw Torgun I win trick, but still really fun, really cool. And so I think we've now talked about the meta as a whole here, and again, I think the game's in a really great spot. I do have some concerns about Con Artist and Corpse Burn, but that's like if we buff Shaman back to one of his old versions and nerfed Con Artist to a 3/3, I think the game would be pretty much perfect. Like, we've got a huge variety, even just up in A tier, and none of the A tier lists are like super oppressive or shutting down any of the other lists, which is a big part of what I'm always talking about. Like, if you put aggro burn in A tier, you now invalidate 90% of the decks here. Now, Con Artist shuffling 2 items, he's still going to be in every deck ever. That doesn't change it, though. Like, 3/4 with the chance of screwing over your opponent's draw, that's still going to happen. Now, I realize I've been talking to chat. This is going to look a little weird on the VOD since none of them are going to see my Twitch chat, but oh well. Right, so he is now slightly less likely to screw you over, but he's still going to be run in every single deck ever because he's the premium 3/4 stat lines with the chance of just bricking your opponent. The brick chance has gone down, but the main deck problem of him just being in every deck and tossing a little coin flip up, did your opponent draw too many bad items in a row? Yeah, okay, well, your life sucks now and you lose. And that's why that wouldn't solve it. He really just needs to lose that premium stat draw or stat line and become like a 3/3, because then you have to look at it and be like, okay, do I really want that item pollution tactic because I'm playing, a bounce deck, or I have a really bad matchup against Leviathan? You then have to think about whether that effect is worth including, a weaker body. It's his health is what's got to go down to keep him from being in just every deck ever. Anyway, so let's get on to just actually looking at some of these decks here, because I've been talking about them for over an hour now, and I'm sure people want to actually see some examples. So let's just try to kind of go through the list here real quick. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the decks, and there's a couple decks that I'm not going to show at all, like Corpse Burn or Fire Bounce. So major spoilers on a lot of decks that I've been working on and saving for showcase here, but I'll still get around to fine-tuning them and showcasing things. So let's just do a quick little rapid fire. Let's look at an example of pretty much everything here. Have I just been... Yes, my headset did shut itself off. Shame. It doesn't seem like it was you, Muck. It seems like my audio cut itself off. Well, anyway, so short summary. Yellow's a cool guy. Here's my version. Go look at it. I was saving this one for a showcase, but let's at least give an example so people have some idea what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Toolbox Dojo. Now let's see, let's keep going down the line here. Oh, right, okay. So here's just a quick example of just kind of on curve Pirate Vikings. Got lots of cool stuff going on. This deck's been posted in the showcase already. It's what I tried to bring to the tournament. Tempo Dojo, lots of cool things going on with it. My last wheel deck's also been posted. Where is that? There you are. Last wheel got really cool things going on with it. Let's see what's next on online here. Oh, we already showed the red resurrection, so on to more B tier style things. Where's my favorite Death Knight list? This list's also been showcased. It got a pretty major update recently. It's doing well for itself, but it does struggle against the Valkyrie lists. This, my more combo zombie list. This one's updated and out in the showcase. Here's Mordanoth. This one hasn't been showcased, so this one's a bit of a spoiler. Here's what I've been working on. Again, when I talked about it while we were going over the meta as a whole, it's got really cool things like Parrot and Witch Doctor. That's kind of a big part of the backbone of the deck. Skeletal Pirate, Parrot, and Witch Doctor with Skeletal Pirate, feeding Mordanoth. That's kind of the best version of that list. Let's see okay. So yeah, other versions of yellow-red control. There's so many of them. You've got the more ramp side using the item kit here to speed into that late game. You've got more of the you've got the Final Flash school variants. Got really cool combos going on there, where you've got the really more aggressive versions. Let me see if I can find an aggro version. It's right here somewhere. Where's the egg version? Egg version is kind of the okay here. No, mid egg. No. Where's the aggro egg? Oh, sure, we'll just look at mid-egg too. This deck's kind of old, probably needs a major update, but, happy medium between, the sacrifice engine and a little bit of high and late game. Here it is, Monkey Rush, there it is. This is, one of the nastiest just rush decks in the game. Again, there's so many cool things you can do in yellow-red. None of them are quite that A-tier power, but they're all really solid and usually don't have really polarized matchups. Okay, dinos. Dino. Right, yeah, another yellow-red example we can look at here. Red did a whole video on the Dino Knight combo tricks there. Really cool things going on. Or, of course, my version, which I showcased already. The Bounce Dinos, which really fun, really solid list. Dinos were S tier briefly, and then they were A tier, but they've fallen to B tier just lately, just because of some of the optimization we've got. The resurrection lists are just so good, as is Last Will and Tempo Dojo. Those are just a little bit more raw power than anything else, which isn't a bad thing, because they're all pretty healthy lists, but they've pushed some other things down to B. Dinos can still absolutely compete. If they get a good hand, there isn't much that can compete with them. I think, yeah, I've showcased my anti-meta take on Lightning here, on the Lightning Flowers. It's a really fun, really solid list. Let's see, okay, so some Frost versions. This one's kind of Resurrection Frost combo. There's, I think I have got a bunch of Frost decks laying around here somewhere. Okay, here's one I was still working on. Kind of leaning more into the Frost angle, but teching druids just for a couple cool tricks. Beast mode to mess with the resurrection, Maldron to counter out screams. There's so many different ways you can build Frost. You could dedicate an entire stream just to talking about Frost decks. My Tomb combo list, which has already been showcased and updated. Then you've got the double screams control. Again, there's a few different versions of this list. This one's just kind of having fun with Trebuchet, which is actually really good in this deck, but you can also double down and, do a little bit more like Corpse Explosion and that kind of thing. But, this deck's all about, screams, doubling the screams with Headmaster, and just buckets and buckets of control. Or one thing I want to just talk about with red, yellow in general. They just have this really strong core package. Being able to run Incinerate, Blaze, Flame Prince, Flame Knight, Sacred Ground, Dragon's Fire, and Eye of Flame, and probably Swordsman. And 90% of that's kind of the core of the 90% of red, yellow decks. And then you've got the other, third of the deck to mess with. But that core is just so solid and lends itself to so many different archetypes. All right. Well, let's go show off this abomination that I've kept hidden because I'm still scared of it. But the Contraband Vileroth School of Time monster. It's a terrifying list that does so many wacky combos. It's got Contraband, which can do crazy stuff. It's got Vileroth, which, goes hand in hand with Contraband, but is similarly crazy. This version, again, isn't really capitalizing on Vileroth super hard like the Dragon version does, but it's got some really wild stuff going on with it. What's next? Alright, nope, not going to show off red, blue aggro in any form, because I do not want people playing that. Again, you're allowed to play it, but I'm not going to help you. Alright, so that's all of B. Moving on to C. Okay, yeah, rats. Let's look at all of our rats. So a little bit of B, a little bit of C here. So this is the one I was talking about, Friends of Dragon, Temple of Gods, with the Lumberjack ramp into the Temple of Gods. You've got the Guerrilla Fighter to search up Rat King with, and just the Freya Friend of Dragon combos are just devastating. Of course, you've got, fancy King Kaiju City hidden in the walls stuff. That's kind of the basis of your rat decks. This one's really cool because of its just devastating combos. Again, it does struggle a bit with the top end meta, but really fun, really viable. Lionel Rats was another version I'm still messing with. This one's really cool, and it can actually compete with, some of the A tier lists really well, but it has the usual purple-yellow list of not having good AoE means it just gets kind of run over by aggro swarms. So unfortunately, despite that this might have been an A tier list, it's down in C, it's down in D actually, whereas Carnimata, it belongs in C. Powerful list, but just struggles with the meta as a whole. Lionel Rats can actually crush all kinds of top tier decks, but just glowing red weak spot. Then we've got the green version, which really gets to get big use out of Crab and Captain Harker. Bouncing these two, especially with Mooncaster, is really nasty. And then of course you get to add the Man the Cannons and Daggerstorm version. So this is the version you play when aggro and swarm's a little out of hand, because this will crush that, but it doesn't quite have that raw power of the Carnimata or the Lionel tricks against the top decks. So that one lives in kind of a weird angle of being good against a lot of the things that give rats a bad time, but being the worst against some of the top decks. Oh yeah, here's another kind of a Frost version I was tinkering with. Because Halls of Frost is a building, so why not try to double down on that? Get some more bounces out of Ice Weaver. And this one was solid, but it didn't quite have the raw power of this one. it was fun. Like it's solid. Like Frost can fit a lot of places. Masochist. I don't think I've updated that. Like I did drop it in like deck discussion at some point. It's probably gotten an update of some kind, but I don't know. Just really fun, really solid. You know, combo-y list. Got lots of cool things going on with it. Oh, let's see what else we. All right, so Leviathan. Do I have a Leviathan, a dedicated Leviathan list laying around here somewhere? Okay, this one's pretty out of date, but this was an example. It was, you know, the idea being the you know, having that anti-meta, anti-revive tech mixed with good swarm AoE and just really lots of draw power here. You know, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 sources of draw. Really lets you, you know, turbo into those Leviathans, lets you do dragon ramp. But it's kind of out of date here. Again, it's just I've been neglecting it just because Con Artist messes with it so much. Let's see here. Where's this Cosmic Sword list? Okay, so here's the another Resurrection list. You know, Revive Kaji is still alive and well, but it still has that glowing red weak spot of struggling against the Aggro Swarm list, but it's doing pretty well for itself in general here. So I just do some. This isn't a deck. This is just a placeholder. It helps me, you know, I organize my stuff a little bit here. And these are just breaks between kind of batches of decks that I'm working on. You know, this is my main bunch of decks that I'm focusing on. You know, everything below here, this is being aggressively tested and tuned for the metagame. Stuff right behind it, this is a little more. It's either, you know, more B, C tiers, so I'm not paying as much of attention to it, or it's stuff that I've just kind of neglected, even if it could have potential, stuff that still needs some more work. But nobody needs to talk about my weird chaotic organization skill anymore here. Let's move on to going down our list here. So we just finished with Leviathan. Oh, right, yeah, dragons. Okay, just all the dragons list. Yeah, okay, so we just looked at... Okay, so here's like this is pretty outdated, but I don't think it really needs any changes either. It's just doing really cool dragon stuff and really maximizing on, you know, getting that Murica dragon trick back. Where's fire dragons? Fire dragons are still one of the stronger dragon lists in general. They're doing pretty well for themselves. You know, they're really good against Swarm. They're really good against Screams. And they've got, you know, the Incinerate to deal with the Last Will tech. You know, they're doing pretty well for themselves. You know, Rakanoth's a pretty cool boy. So this dragon deck, this one might still be B tier. It's just I just haven't touched dragons like at all since the Temple nerf. You know, I played 1 or 2 games on my my green. Yeah, I shunted that way up here at the top. Where's my old dragon versions? Yeah, Dragon Levi. Yeah, this was a deck that I played a ton. Like I had like 80 wins on this list for a while, but then Con Artists started going into every deck, and then the Draconic Temple got nerfed, and I just immediately, I haven't touched it for like a month now. Once upon a time, I think this was like the best deck in the game, but Con Artist and the Dragon Temple nerf just really messed it up. Fire dragons might still be B tier though. I haven't tested them enough to really say for sure. So sometimes things just earn C tier just by virtue of I haven't paid enough attention to them yet. Now where's Frost dragons? I know I've got Frost dragons around here somewhere. I think Frost dragons still have some good potential, but again, I've been neglecting Frost in general because of how popular ninjas are. Well, I can't find Frost Dragons. They're in here somewhere, probably. Oh, here it is. Okay, here's Frost Dragons. Just doing really fun tempo lightning tricks and, frost tricks. Just really solid deck. It's kind of just another version of the big yellow revive list, just sporting Draconic Temple instead of the Resurrection angle, which is pretty solid, but it's just worse than the Resurrection deck. So that's probably a B tier list. It's just, unfortunately, just strictly worse than the Resurrection angle. So it's in C because it's neglected, not because it's bad. Where's that? Where are those Torgon decks? Okay, so this is a really cool list. There's been some other people playing with it, but only runs 9 units, runs a boatload of control, uses Dojo to super buff up Landshark and Killer Rabbit, and then just multiply the hell out of them. And really cool combo deck. But, if you don't draw Torgon, you lose. We've done our best to make it consistent by including a lot of draw and ninja training, but I cannot rate something that is so reliant on drawing a single card any higher than D. Oh, yes, Middle School. Let's go look at that. That's one of those. It's a mid-range school deck. It's the Final Flash. Oh, this one's actually dragons, right. Yeah, I forgot this was a dragon deck. Just because, if we're playing Forbidden City, that gives us a strong chance of getting Draconic Temple anyways. That's, may as well double down on that tribal chance there. So, Final Flash draws you a ton of time, as Drawmoth got wacky School of Time combos. So, just a fun kind of mid-range fire deck that leans into the school of mid-range dragon deck that leans into the school combo. School package being Grendel, Headwood, Library, School, and your choice of massive card generation. Speaking of which, let's go look at the dwarf version of that. So the dwarf version's very cool. Just the amount of insane card generation you can get off of Blacksmith, as well as tutoring up your additional items there is pretty wild. And this deck's actually not even bothered by con artists, because you're just going to discard those items anyways. They don't bother you. You're like, more items to search out of your deck. Cool, I'm fine with that. But it just has the problem of, if this deck managed to stick a Grendel, School, or Library for a turn, it's probably going to win. But doing that is easier said than done. Now, where's that? What else we need to look at here? Okay, I'm not going to show off Aggro Swarm because I think that deck is way too polarized and unhealthy for the game in general, so don't want to be propagating that. But that's why we showed off 4 fun and healthy Swarm decks, and we're not going to talk about Aggro Swarm, except for how bad it is for the game. Let's see. I think the last C tier list to look at here is like Joan Vive, Last Will. It's around here somewhere. Oh yeah, we've got, Night decks, again, another really cool angle you can build. Red-yellow, there's so many different cool B-tier red-yellow lists you can play. Where is that Joan Vive Last Will deck? I know it's around here somewhere. It's hiding. Oh, alright, and I did keep my starter decks because I like having them in case I want to play a new player, or I want to play somebody that says you're only good because your collection's big. I'm like, fine, I'll go play a starter deck. Oh, here it is. Joan Vive Albert's up here. So, just really solid list. It's got the little ramp engine for accelerated Last Will shenanigans that's resistant to other control decks, but it just has the same problem that these color combinations usually did. You just get so rolled over by Aggro Swarm or just aggressive tempo that it's too too much of glowing red weak spot to rate highly. I think there's a couple more. Oh yes, the furnace deck. So this one's a little bit of a meme, but it's also like a wildly powerful combo. But again, Con Artist just gives it such a bad time that... Where is that furnace? Here it is. Okay, furnace is just a wild deck, but like it has a problem of if it doesn't draw furnace or library, or if these get answered, the deck just rolls over and dies. But if it does draw one of those and they don't get immediately answered, oh boy, are you going to turbo into like turn 4 or 5 Leviathans? Oh no. This deck is terrifying. Like if you leave furnace alive for a turn, prepare to face down turn 4 and 5 Leviathans. While also, having your board wiped. Like, it's a little bit of a meme deck because, again, Con Artist and Building Destruction is so prevalent, but it's a horrifying meme deck. Okay, let's see. I don't think I even want to show off the Veil OTK decks. That deck still scares me, and if Con Artist does get nerfed, I don't want to be responsible for that taking over the meta. But I will show off the Item Ragnar, because that one's actually a really cool deck that I like a lot. Storm Weapon's just a really cool card. Really ruining my pool of potential showcase stuff. But I think showcases are still fun, because, all these decks are probably going to get updates and changes. And, really diving into how the decks work, I think is still worth showcasing. Here's Item Ragnar. Yeah, just multiplying Kunai, Dwarven Mithril, and Storm Weapon with the hyper-consistent Dwarf Tutor package, mixed with the ability to bounce Dwarven Blacksmith. A handful of free Kunais is devastating with Yuna, or just, just the insane amount of value of being able to duplicate Storm Weapons, which just put out really strong units that have Ragnar synergy. Really cool deck, but like Con Artist, this deck cannot function with Con Artist showing up, which is kind of a good thing, because I'm, still even a little bit afraid of this deck. Just because of how strong it has the potential to be, but Con Artist just wrecks it so hard. Now let's see what else we got. Still have a church list. I probably still have. Okay, here's like just a vague example of church school. It does some funky things. Using Firestorm to damage all your stuff, and then healing everything with Cleric or Sacred Ground's not in here. Sacred Ground should probably be in here for the heal, but that is what it is. I haven't spent a lot of time on it. Really cool, funky combos that you can do. Let's see. What else we need to look? We're very near the end of... Oh yeah, there's like Spectral Dojo. I think that's pretty much the end of things. Because Spectral Rider's a pretty cool card. And that if you sweet spot buff him to the right stat line, or just going all in and making him massive, you get some really cool stuff going on. Anyway, so huge spoiler of my collection of showcase potentials in the future. As you saw, that's still only covered about like half the decks I actually have, and there's a lot more silly off-meta things that you can play as well. It's one of the widest metas I've seen in a game period. I'm pretty happy with it overall. I think that's a pretty good snapshot of the meta as a whole. I look forward to hearing everyone else's thoughts on the list, which I will post the image for shortly. Need to go fix that one little rat image, and then I'll post it. So thanks for stopping by, everyone. It's getting kind of late, so I need to call it a night.